Okay, here's lecture two of the 1960s. Again, I wanted to use the same basic image for the introduction to these lectures, showing the diverse range of Hollywood culture, but also the diverse range of protests in the 60s. I'd like to start by talking about Vietnam and something called the New Left. And really the focus question, if we want to have one for this period, is how did the Vietnam War transform American politics and culture? I think it did it by challenging a lot of the status quo. The rise of a white youth student movement was really a surprise to many. Colleges had long been conservative institutions that drew their students from the privileged strata of American society, and few thought that college students in the 1960s had anything to complain about. But student definitions of freedom, as they took form in a critique of mainstream values and institutions, started a protest movement that came to be known as the New Left. What made the New Left new was its rejection of the political and intellectual categories that had shaped radicalism and liberalism for most of the 20th century. It challenged mainstream America and the old left of the 1930s and 1940s. Unlike the Communist Party, the American Communist Party anyway, it did not see the Soviet Union as a model society or view the working class as the main agent of social change. Okay. Not language of economic equality and social citizenship, but the language of loneliness, of isolation, alienation, and powerless in a bureaucratic society whose affluence denied authenticity characterized New Left expression. The baby boom produced a mass generation influenced by these ideas, as more than 7 million attended college by 1968. The New Left ultimately had roots in the American Revolution and the critique made by the abolitionists of the gap between American values and realities. The abolitionists, of course, of the run-up to the Civil War. It was inspired by the cultural radicalisms of the 1910s and the 1950s, but its most immediate inspiration was the Black Freedom Movement. The 60s, if we want to put that in quotation marks, was a decade of political, racial, and cultural turmoil, was born of claims made by those who felt excluded from society, from Southern and urban blacks to middle-class students. Both the Black movement and the white New Left shared the belief that evils were deeply embedded in America's institutions and could only be resolved through direct confrontation. In 1962, books appeared that challenged the 1950s consensus. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time captured the anger of blacks. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring showed the environmental costs of economic growth, and Rachel Carson very famously is from Springdale, just outside Pittsburgh. And Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities criticized the urban renewal and highway construction that made cities larger and less diverse, and thus less livable and socially interactive. But in some ways, the most influential critique came in 1962 from a small group of liberal and radical college students called the Students for Democratic Society. Their Port Huron statement, composed at Port Huron, Michigan, criticized American institutions, including political parties, including corporations, including unions, and the military-industrial complex. But the document inspired new student radicalism with its vision of social change. The statement's authors called for the creation of a democracy of individual participation, where the, quote, individual shares in those social decisions determining the quality and direction of his life. You see, freedom for the New Left meant participatory democracy. Now, this kind of rather vague standard was used to judge existing social arrangements or workplaces, schools, government were found to be deeply flawed and undemocratic. The New Left rejected a society run by experts, which of course had been the dream of the progressives in their generation. Students for Democratic Society grew quickly to 8,000 members by the end of 1962, and in 1964, events at the University of California at Berkeley revealed the power of the student movement. This university, which was an immense and bureaucratic Cold War institution, and one of these things from the Defense Education Act, remember I talked about, imposed a new rule that banned political groups from using the central area of the campus to distribute ideas and literature. This sparked massive protests. Students, including conservatives, created a movement for free expression. Protest leaders likened the university to a knowledge factory and encouraged students to break the machines. Massive protests for months, known as the free speech movement, caused the university to rescind its ban on free expression. Now, SDS, this is a picture of SDS at the University of Delaware, yearbook photo of 1963, I think. And this shows that, despite their raised fists, they appear, very respectable compared to radicals who emerged later in the decade. And of course, the group is made up of entirely of white students. Now, SDS wasn't very large in terms of actual numbers nationwide, but it was very, very influential. It punched way above its weight in terms of what it was able to, how the impact it was able to have on student thought. And this is a picture of, you might not be able to see it, but in the center of the picture there, standing on a car hood, was Mario Savio, a leader of the 1964 free speech movement at the University of California at Berkeley, addressing the crowd on campus. Great. And as you can imagine, the Vietnam War was one of the major things that students were protesting about. You see, the Vietnam War transformed African American and New Left protest into a sort of generational rebellion. The war, which is a logical extension of Cold War assumptions and policies, demonstrated the danger of treating the world and every local situation through a simple anti-communist lens. Few Americans, even policymakers deciding to go to war, knew much about Vietnam's history or culture at all, if at all. Cold War administrations viewed a complex national liberations struggle led by homegrown communists who had broad popular support and Soviet backing. They viewed all that as a test of containment. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations had supported France's failed efforts to retain Vietnam as a colony, but then cast their lot with the South Vietnamese government in violation of Geneva Accords that had promised elections to unify both North and South Vietnam. By the 1960s, the United States supported Diem's brutal and corrupt regime in the South. Fears that voters would not forgive them if they lost Vietnam made Kennedy and Johnson reluctant to remove U.S. aid and forces from Vietnam. Kennedy's advisors saw Vietnam as a test of whether the United States could successfully conduct counterinsurgencies. Those are interventions against internal uprisings in non-communist countries. They wanted to do this in order to stop third world revolutions. But U.S. advisors in Vietnam aiding Diem's government would not check the progress of the communist-led Viet Cong insurgency. And in October 1963, after large Buddhist protests against Diem's regime, the United States approved a military coup that led to Diem's death. While Kennedy quietly questioned the wisdom of Vietnam, 17,000 American military advisors were in South Vietnam at the time of his assassination. Lyndon Johnson took office with relatively little experience in foreign relations. Now, while reluctant to send U.S. troops to South Vietnam and fearing interminable involvement, he felt that losing Vietnam would deliver electoral advantages to Republicans. And in 1964, North Vietnamese boats encountered an American ship on a spy mission off North Vietnam's coast, and when the boats fired on the U.S. vessel, Johnson claimed the United States was the victim of aggression. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, authorizing the president to take measures to defend U.S. forces in Vietnam. Only 2 senators voted against the resolution, which is the nearest the United States came to declaring war in the conflict, and it passed without any discussion of U.S. goals or strategies. In the 1964 election campaign, Johnson said he did not intend to send U.S. troops to Vietnam. Okay. Advised to do so after the proper provocation, he launched airstrikes against North Vietnam and sent U.S. ground troops to the south, where the Viet Cong in early 1965 had attacked a U.S. air base. By 1968, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were at war in Vietnam. U.S. forces bombed North and South Vietnam with more tonnage than was used by all sides in World War II. U.S. ground forces hunted the Viet Cong in search and destroy operations that left villages burned and many civilians killed. But the might of the U.S. military did not break the Viet Cong insurgency or its North Vietnamese support. At the same time, Johnson sent U.S. troops to the Dominican Republic, where military leaders tried to restore the rule of Juan Bosch, a left-wing but non-communist president who in 1963 had been removed from power by a military coup. Johnson dispatched troops to quell unrest and ensure that Bosch would not return. With rising casualties and the massive bombing of North and South Vietnam, the Cold War consensus began to disintegrate. By 1968, the war had sidetracked much of the Great Society and had divided families, universities, and the Democratic Party. With both liberal and conservative political leaders committed to the war, young activists lost confidence in the political system. Opposition to the war united all kinds of grievances and discontent with American society. With college students exempted from the draft, the fighting of the war fell to poor and working class draftees. In 1967, even Martin Luther King, a one-time ally of President Johnson, condemned the war for its violence and its diversion of resources from the United States. To SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, the war seemed to epitomize the antithesis of participatory democracy, since the U.S. intervention had risen from secret commitments and decisions made by political elites, with no real debate. SDS organized the first major anti-war demonstration, which occurred outside Washington, D.C. in April 1965, and from there protests spread across the country. By 1967, young men were burning their draft cards and fleeing to Canada to avoid fighting what they believed to be an unjust war. In October 1967, as many as 100,000 anti-war protesters converged on the Pentagon. Okay. This is a photograph whose date is unknown, and it may come from the 50s. I have a suspicion from his late 50s or early 60s, but it's members of the National Liberation Front which fought the United States in Vietnam. And women made up a substantial part of the NLF, and this helped the North Vietnamese gain a lot of support in many places in the world. This is a picture of Secretary of Defense John McNamara. He's on the left, and his deputy Cyrus Vance on the right, at a May 1965 meeting at the White House where the war in Vietnam was discussed. Okay, now there's a bust of President Kennedy in the background, and kind of showing you the legacy of JFK's involvement in Vietnam. And McNamara later wrote in his memoirs that his misgivings about the war only grew as the war progressed. And here's a map of the Vietnam War, 64 to 75. It shows aerial bombing and small guerrilla skirmishes. It shows that those things were the major features of the Vietnam War, not fixed land battles, right? And at the time it was fought, Vietnam was one among the longest wars in American history, and the only one the United States was considered to have lost. These are American soldiers in South Vietnam carrying wounded men to safety after a 1966 battle. And on the home front, you had a very, very different among young people, and a lot of young people, and you had a very, very different situation. This is Timothy Leary, promoter of the hallucinogenic drug LSD, at something called a Human Be-In in San Francisco in 1967. Okay, a very popular gathering of young people in 1967 looking for alternative ways to raise their consciousness. And here, of course, is a poster from the famous Woodstock Festival of 1969, listing some of the performers at the festival. A dove of peace sits on a guitar, symbolizing the overlap between the anti-war movement and the counterculture. This is a picture of the Jesus People. This is a gathering, one of the religious groups that sprang up in the 1960s. Okay, the Jesus People were very, very interesting because they were obviously Christian, but they were very much focused on just Christ himself and Christ's teachings, not necessarily with the rest of the Bible, or especially not with the way established churches, large churches, had sort of interpreted the Bible and presented it to their congregations. The Jesus People were very much of the mind that, followers should follow Jesus as much as in the similar ways to the disciples did. Okay, and I just put this picture in here. This is a picture of yoga. Among the religious developments of the 1960s was the spread of interest in Eastern religions and religious practices. Yoga was for Americans, yoga was a brand new thing in the 60s. And this is a cover of Yoga Journal, and it illustrates how one practice has entered the mainstream of American life. Okay, now you'll notice that these are not young hippies, right? These are women in middle age who are doing yoga. So this is from the late 60s, showing that things like yoga had a broad appeal. There was also in the 1960s something that historians call the rights revolution. And I think a focus question for this section of the lecture would be, what were the sources and significance of the rights revolution of the late 1960s? Perhaps the most important of these was the women's movement. Okay, the sexual revolution of the 60s also contributed to the birth of the second wave of feminism in the late 1960s. The civil rights movement had inspired other Americans to express their grievances and claim rights. Many borrowed the militant tactics of blacks and students and adopted their language of power and liberation, and rejected traditional organizations and approaches. Okay, women's suffrage had not ended women's lack of power and opportunity. When the 1960s began, only a few women held political office. So women were still restricted to traditionally female occupations, and major universities limited the number of women admitted. But a new feminist consciousness began to emerge in 1963 with the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Friedan criticized the emptiness of consumer culture and emphasized middle-class discontent. Her book portrayed talented and educated women trapped in a world in which they believed marriage and motherhood were the primary ambitions of life. Women's lives still revolved around the home, now a suburban home mostly, which Betty Friedan called a comfortable concentration camp. The book focused attention on feminist concerns. In 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, barring sex discrimination among those holding the same job. The Civil Rights Act prohibited inequalities based on sex as well as race. The Equal Opportunity Commission challenged barriers to women's employment. And in 1966, the National Organization for Women was formed with Betty Friedan as the president, as a civil rights organization to press for equal opportunity in jobs, education, and political participation. A different kind of feminist movement emerged from the civil rights and student movements. Young women who embraced ideologies of equality and freedom and learned political organizing skills, once facing inequality and sexual exploitation within their own movement, formed their own movements. Some white women in civil rights work drew parallels between the treatment of blacks and women. In SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, women protested their subordination and exploitation by male activists. By 1967, women were forming consciousness-raising groups to discuss the causes of their discontent. The movement began to the movement began sensationally at the Miss America beauty pageant in 1968 in Atlantic City, where women threw bras into the trash can. Significantly, they did not burn bras. The burning bra thing is a myth. And they threw in high-heeled shoes and copies of Playboy and Cosmopolitan, okay, to protest against the objectification of women. And one thing that's usually not talked about is, people talk about bra burning and stuff and these kind of protests, but I want to talk about the other ways in which these protests were conducted. In 1967, in a celebrated incident arising from the new feminism, a race official tried to eject Catherine Switzer from the Boston Marathon, right, which would have been restricted only to men, believe it or not, as late as 1967, and that race official was only pushed aside by other runners. Okay, considered too fragile for the marathon, whose course is something like 26.2 miles or 26.6 miles. Women had been prohibited from running in this marathon and in I think all others. Switzer competed the race, and today hundreds of thousands of women, of course, compete in marathons every year. Now, the race official here you can see is behind Catherine Switzer, who's there, number 261. She had started the race with a hood over her head and a sort of a hat on, and the people did notice that she was a woman. And this race official in street clothes is running up behind her, trying to eject her from the race. But two other male runners are forcing him off the course. Now, later on, this race official would change his mind about female participation, and sort of famously became a great champion for women runners, and he sort of went around to running clubs, sort of promoting women's running, along with Catherine Switzer's a sort of like come to Jesus moment about the rightness of female participation. This is a 1970 photograph of women's lib demonstration at the Statue of Liberty. Right. This is what. This is in the front. There's a symbol you don't really see anymore. This is the equality symbol for women, the symbol of women, plus the equal sign. That's a sign you don't. That's the sign you don't really see anymore, despite the fact that the Equal Rights Amendment still hasn't been ratified by the country. The women's lib movement greatly expanded the idea of freedom by insisting that it should be applied to the most personal and intimate parts of life. These feminists introduced terms like sexism, sexual politics, and the phrase, quote, "the personal is political." And they argued that sexual relations, marriage, and beauty standards were just as political as war, civil rights, and class tensions. They repudiated the sacred nuclear family of the 1950s and permanently changed Americans' definition of freedom. Radical feminists first campaigned for the repeal of state laws that denied women the right to terminate a pregnancy. They defined control over reproduction as the most basic of women's freedoms. But women's liberation concerns went far beyond sexual freedom. Interests range from combating domestic violence to inequalities in the law, in churches and workplaces, and in the family. And by 1970, feminist ideas were penetrating mainstream American life. As I'll no doubt say many times in a lecture about the 70s, the two biggest things that I remember from the 70s are feminism, women's rights, and the oil crisis. They seem to capture the imagination or the consciousness of Americans most fully in that decade. But perhaps the greatest surprise of the 1960s was the movement for gay liberation. Gays and lesbians had formed societies in the 1950s, but these were not protest groups. The homosexuals faced stigmatization as sinful or mentally ill, and most states had made homosexual acts illegal. Police harassed gays in major cities like San Francisco and New York. Most gays and lesbians kept their sexuality in the closet, but the 1960s transformed gay politics. One moment in particular marks the beginning of gay liberation. This was the 1969 riot caused by a police raid on the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in New York's Greenwich Village. Instead of complying with the police as they usually had, gays fought back, and in a few years, gay pride marches were being held in cities across the country. This is a 1970 poster urging gay men and lesbians to come out to join the Gay Liberation Front, one of the numerous movements that sprang to life in the late 1960s. Now, although this rights revolution of which I speak began in the streets, it won constitutional legitimacy in the Supreme Court, traditionally the most conservative branch of the American government. Guided by Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court greatly expanded the rights of all Americans and placed them beyond the reach of the legislative branch and also beyond the reach of local majorities. It's something that has changed in our own time. The court's move towards protecting civil liberties and rights began in the 1930s, but was signaled really in 1957 when the court started to try to stop McCarthyism, and did it by overturning the convictions of individuals who had advocated overthrowing the government. Okay. It had not answered the question of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or had refused to. These are people who had not answered the questions of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or had refused to state their political beliefs to state officials. By 1969, the court had affirmed the right to uphold unpopular views, and dismantled Cold War loyalties, the Cold War loyalty security system. In the 1950s and 1960s, civil liberties became integrated with civil rights. The court protected the rights of private citizens to keep their secret membership lists and secured modern freedom for freedom of the press. In the 60s, the court continued to strike down numerous state segregation laws. In Loving versus Virginia, 1967, the court declared that the Virginia law banning interracial marriage was unconstitutional. In 1968, the court made racial discrimination in rental or the sale of housing illegal. The court also pressed states to respect civil liberties enshrined in the Bill of Rights. It required states to abide by protections against illegal search and seizure, to honor defendants' rights to a speedy trial, to prohibit cruel and unusual punishments, and to secure the rights of poor defendants to receive publicly supported counsel. In the Miranda versus Arizona trial in 1966, which is one of the most important of these decisions, the individuals are supposed to be made aware of their rights upon arrest, including their right to remain silent and to confer with a lawyer before answering any questions. The court also ruled to oversee fairness of the democratic processes at the state and local level by establishing the principle that districts electing members of state legislatures must be equal in population, in a famous case in 1962. They also moved to solidify the wall between church and state by decreeing that prayers and Bible readings in public schools were unconstitutional. The Warren Court also outlined entirely new rights in response to changes in American society. Most dramatically, it invented a constitutional right to privacy in 1965. It overturned a state law banning the use of contraceptives. Although the Constitution nowhere articulates the right to privacy, Justice William O. Douglas, the author of that decision, asserted that privacy was the basis of all other freedoms, and that a constitutionally protected area of privacy within marriage could be inferred from the Bill of Rights. The court soon made privacy a right of individuals within or outside marriage, by ensuring access to birth control, and most controversially, by creating a constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy in the Roe v. Wade case of 1973. And that was a major victory for the feminist movement, and of course is a source of major contention to this day. Okay. These rulings seem to accept the view that families were collections of individuals rather than a unit with a single authority, and women gained multiple rights within the family, including protection against rape and assault by husbands. This is a picture of Liberty's crown. This celebrates the rights revolution as an expression of liberty, right? And you see all these rights attached to the rays coming off of the Statue of Liberty's crown. This is the Loving family I mentioned a minute ago. This is Richard and Mildred Loving with their children in a 1965 photograph. Their desire to live in Virginia as man and wife led to a Supreme Court decision declaring state laws that barred interracial marriages unconstitutional. And here is a famous, again, Herb Bloch is one of these cartoonists that just keeps coming up and up again in this course and in American history in general, because he's such an accurate and acerbic critic. He's commenting on critics of the Supreme Court's decision barring prayer in public schools. Now you might not be able to read the caption here, but at the top it says the father's shouting, "What do they expect us to do? Listen to the kids pray at home?" Now, one of the ways in which the 1960s can be condensed or distilled or compressed into studying 1 year is to look at 1968. And I think that 1968 really was a climactic year for the 1960s. But we need to discuss in what ways was that really the climax of the 1960s. And frankly, it really showed the sort of disintegration of society, the society that had been sort of accepted up until that time. Profound events happened so quickly in 1968 that society itself seemed to be disintegrating. In January, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, which was multiple uprisings throughout South Vietnam that took major cities and completely surprised U.S. military leaders. U.S. forces repelled the attacks and inflicted heavy losses, but the intense fighting, captured on television, eroded the confidence of the public in political and military leaders who repeatedly claimed that victory was not far off. Leading figures in politics and the press now criticized the war. Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war senator from Minnesota, announced he would seek the Democratic presidential nomination, and with the support of thousands of students, won the New Hampshire primary. Lyndon Johnson, stunned at this, refused to send 200,000 more troops to Vietnam as the Army suggested, and declared in 1968 that he would not seek re-election. This is a major, major event, and peace talks began in Paris. At the time, Martin Luther King was organizing a Poor People's March on Washington to demand more federal anti-poverty programs. But after traveling to Memphis to support a strike by black sanitation workers there, King was murdered by a white assassin. And the greatest outbreak of urban violence in American history soon erupted. Washington, D.C. had to be occupied by soldiers before order was restored. And there were riots everywhere, including in Pittsburgh and East Liberty and Homewood. At the end of April, students protesting Columbia University's participation in defense research and its plan to build a gymnasium in a public park occupied campus buildings and were forcibly removed by police. And then in June, a young Palestinian nationalist assassinated Robert F. Kennedy, who was seeking the Democratic nomination as an anti-war candidate. In August, tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to protest the nomination of Vice President Hubert Humphrey for the Democratic nomination for president in 1960. And Chicago's police wildly overreacted and attacked the demonstrators. The government, by the way, indicted 8 radicals for conspiring to insult the violence, and after a tumultuous trial of the famous Chicago 8, several were found guilty, although their charges were overturned on appeal because of what was, frankly, a flagrant degree of bias by the judge. Okay. Talk to your grandparents. It's amazing in many ways that the United States survived 1968. This is a picture of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, striking sanitation workers. As their sign suggests, they demanded respect as well as higher wages. And this is the strike that Martin Luther King went to Memphis to support when he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And then, of course, followed by the Robert Kennedy assassination in Los Angeles in June, really tore the heart out of the country. People were just extremely shocked all over. This is a very, very famous poster, and one of the most widely publicized acts of nonviolent protest of the 1960s. American athletes Tommy Smith in the center and John Carlos on the right raised their fists in a black power salute at the medal ceremony for the 200-meter dash at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. Okay. They were denounced for politicizing the Olympics, and the U.S. Olympic Committee expelled them, but they have since gone on to become cultural heroes. Now, although 1968 was a year of radical protest, it also marked a conservative reaction. Social protests sparked calls for law and order. Black militancy provoked white backlash, which is a growing force in politics. The Supreme Court's intervention and protection of rights led to claims that distant federal bureaucrats were meddling with local tradition, one of the classic arguments against these kinds of changes that's been going on since the 1950s. And in August, Richard Nixon made a striking political comeback by winning the Republican presidential nomination. He campaigned as a champion of the, quote, silent majority, ordinary Americans who believed that change had gone too far, and he called for law and order. Facing a divided Democratic Party, Nixon barely won a victory over Hubert Humphrey. And then also you have to take into account George Wallace, who was running as an independent on a platform of against civil rights, against the Great Society, against the Warren Court. He received 13% of the national vote. So if you take the Nixon and Wallace totals together, it shows that liberalism and progressivism after 1968 was certainly in retreat. But 1968 didn't mark the end of the 60s. Johnson's Great Society actually peaked under Nixon. And second wave feminism surged in the 1970s. But Nixon's election initiated a period of conservatism in American politics. So the 1960s didn't produce a revolution, but it did revolutionize American life. It produced new rights and understandings of freedom. It allowed racial minorities to enter mainstream American life, although it didn't solve urban poverty. It started to transform women's status. It made Americans expect new things from the government, like clean air and old age medical insurance. But it also undermined public confidence in political leaders. Okay? Relations between the generations and between whites and non-whites, along with every institution in society, changed. The debates in the 1960s would live on in later questions and controversies, and the nation became much more conservative. The 1960s became blamed for many social ills. However, the United States became more open, more tolerant, and more free in this decade. Here's a map showing the very complicated 1968 presidential election. The sort of pinkish, orangish colors are the Republicans, who won 56% of the vote. Right? 43.2% of the popular vote. The Greens are Democrats, who won 42.6% of the popular vote. But you see, again, just like the election in 1960, that the winning candidate really won a significant margin in the electoral college. The American Independent Party, which was Wallace's party, won 46 electoral votes, which is larger, I think, than any third-party candidate since forever, right? And that was certainly enough to keep the. Well, this showed that the solid South that had been Democratic since way back was completely gone. You notice that all the southern states in the Southeast, anyway, not including Texas, were all either Republican or American Independent. Okay, and by American Independent, it really means the Wallace Party. Okay, here's a painting by Robert Rauschenberg from 1970, and it represents a collage of images from the turbulent 1960s. And clockwise from the upper left, it shows troops putting down urban riding. Robert F. Kennedy there, Janis Joplin, the peace demonstrators. As we go down clockwise, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King after his assassination, and of course an astronaut on the moon, which was the crowning American achievement of the 1960s in 1969. Okay. This is a very, very good, symbol of the 1960s. And notice how many of these things represented in this picture came in the late 60s: the assassinations, Woodstock, the landing on the moon, and that sort of thing. So the 70s become even more interesting because the 60s were so turbulent. But we'll talk about that next week.